Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of the evening, where mysteries unfold like snowflakes settling upon windowsills, where the gentle crackle of hearth fires mingles with whispered secrets, and where sleep finds you in the tender embrace of a story told just for you. Tonight, we journey together to Victorian London in the depths of winter, to that familiar address on Baker Street, where gaslight flickers against frosted panes, and the great detective awaits another curious case. This is a tale designed to slow your racing thoughts, to guide you gently toward peaceful sleep, to wrap around you like a warm blanket as the world outside grows quiet and still. So, wherever you find yourself in this moment, whatever distant shore or familiar room, take a deep breath with me now. Let your shoulders soften, allow your eyes to rest, and know that there is nothing you need to do but listen, drift, and dream. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The snow fell upon London that Christmas Eve with a silence so profound it seemed to muffle even the memory of sound. Through the tall windows of 221B Baker Street, the world transformed into a painting, rendered in whites and greys, each rooftop and chimney pot crowned with soft accumulations of winter's quiet gift. Inside those familiar rooms, the fireplace breathed its warm commentary upon the cold night, flames dancing their eternal dance in shades of amber and gold, casting shadows that moved like living things across the Persian rug and up the walls where the gaslight flickered in its bronze sconce. I sat in my accustomed chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me as I shifted to gaze out at the transformed city, my notebook resting forgotten upon my knee. Across from me, Sherlock Holmes stood at the window, one hand pressed against the cold glass, his silhouette lean and thoughtful against the pale curtain of falling snow. He had been standing thus for nearly an hour, watching the street below with that peculiar intensity that could transform the most ordinary observation into a matter of profound significance. Orchestrated Victorian narrative, pacing with atmospheric shifts and sensory immersion. "Remarkable," he murmured at length, his breath creating small clouds of condensation upon the window pane. "The way the snow accumulates, Watson. Observe how it gathers more heavily upon the northern exposures, how it drifts in the sheltered doorways, how it reveals the unseen currents of air that move through our streets like invisible rivers." "It is beautiful," I agreed, reaching for the teapot that sat warming by the fire. The porcelain was pleasantly hot beneath my fingers as I poured, the steam rising with its familiar scent of bergamot and distant hillsides. Though I confess, I find myself hoping for a quiet evening. Surely no clients will venture out in such weather. Holmes turned from the window with a slight smile playing about his thin lips. "On the contrary, my dear Watson, it is precisely on such nights that the most interesting cases present themselves. When ordinary folk huddle beside their fires, those driven by desperation or darker purpose must still pursue their aims. The snow does not stop crime, it merely makes it more visible." As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps crunching through fresh snow reached us from the street below, accompanied by the jingle of harness bells and the soft whicker of a horse. Holmes's eyes brightened with that particular gleam that spoke of intellectual appetite awakened. He moved swiftly to the window, peering down into the lamplit street. "A hansom cab," he observed, stopping at our door, the horse steaming in the cold, the driver wrapped against the weather, and our visitor. He paused, leaning closer to the glass, is a woman, well dressed despite the hour, moving with urgency but without panic. She carries something beneath her cloak, something she guards carefully. Mrs. Hudson will be announcing her momentarily. Indeed, the familiar tread of our landlady's footsteps soon sounded upon the stairs, followed by a gentle knock upon our door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face flushed from the warmth of the kitchen fires below, bearing a calling card upon her silver tray. "A Lady Pemberton to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, her voice soft with the deference she reserved for nobility. She apologizes for the late hour, but says the matter is most urgent. Holmes gestured his acceptance, and within moments our visitor entered, bringing with her a swirl of cold air and snowflakes that melted upon contact with the room's warmth. Lady Pemberton was a woman of perhaps 40 years, handsome rather than beautiful, with intelligent eyes that assessed the room and its occupants with quick precision. She wore a deep blue travelling cloak trimmed with fur, and beneath it, as Holmes had observed, she clutched a bundle wrapped in velvet cloth. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, her voice steady, despite whatever urgency had brought her out into the winter night. "I apologize for disturbing you at such an hour, but I find myself in possession of something quite impossible, and I know not where else to turn." Holmes indicated the chair nearest the fire, which she accepted gratefully, though she did not relinquish her mysterious bundle. I poured her tea without asking, adding sugar and cream in the proportions that seemed appropriate for a woman who had just braved a snowstorm, and she accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. "Please," Holmes said, settling into his own chair and steepling his fingers beneath his chin in that characteristic pose of focused attention. "Tell us everything, and omit no detail, however trivial it may seem." Lady Pemberton drew a steadying breath, the firelight playing across her features as she began her tale. "My family estate, Pemberton Hall, lies some 30 miles north of London in Hertfordshire. It is an old house, Mr. Holmes, very old, dating back to the 14th century in parts, though much has been rebuilt and modernized over the generations. The grounds are extensive, including a small lake, a homewood, and what was once a medieval chapel, now in picturesque ruin." She paused to sip her tea, and I noticed how the cup trembled slightly in her hands, the only outward sign of her inner disturbance. For as long as anyone can remember, our family has maintained certain traditions surrounding the winter season. One of these involves the creation of a snow figure each year on the eve of Christmas, a tradition said to date back to some medieval ancestor who made a vow following his return from the Crusades. The figure is always built in the same location, beside the old chapel ruins, and it is always fashioned in the same way, a tall man-like shape with specific symbols carved into its body. The fire crackled loudly, sending up a shower of sparks, and Lady Pemberton glanced toward it before continuing, her voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "3 days ago, we constructed this year's snow figure as tradition demands. My groundskeeper, old Thomas, who has performed this duty for 40 years, shaped it with his customary care. That evening, all was as it should be. The figure stood sentinel beside the chapel, a simple form of packed snow, perhaps 7 feet in height. But the next morning, when the household awoke, she set down her teacup with a gentle clink against the saucer, her hands now moving to the velvet bundle in her lap. The figure had moved, Mr. Holmes. It stood not beside the chapel, but 30 feet distant, near the edge of the woods. The snow around its new position showed no footprints, no signs of disturbance, as though it had simply appeared there. And more disturbing still, its form had changed. Where we had shaped a simple figure, we now found something altogether more detailed, more deliberate. The features were more defined, the proportions more human. And this. She unwrapped the velvet cloth with trembling fingers, revealing an object that caught the firelight with a strange greenish gleam. It was a small figurine, perhaps 6 inches tall, carved from some pale stone that seemed to hold its own internal luminescence. The craftsmanship was exquisite, depicting a robed figure with outstretched hands, its face serene but somehow unsettling in its perfect symmetry. This was found pressed into the snow figure's chest, embedded so deeply that Thomas needed a spade to extract it. We have nothing like it at Pemberton Hall, no record of such an object in our family collections. It appears to be very old, possibly medieval, and it radiates a coldness that seems unnatural, Mr. Holmes. Even now, hours after being brought indoors, it remains as icy to the touch as when it was first discovered. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes alight with interest, but he did not yet reach for the strange artifact. Outside, the snow continued its silent descent, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour with soft, muffled strokes. Before you fall asleep, write in the comments what time it is for you and where you are from. Most intriguing, Holmes murmured, his gaze fixed upon the pale figurine. And you say this occurred 3 days ago. What has transpired since? Lady Pemberton's expression grew more troubled, shadows deepening in the hollows of her face as she leaned closer to the fire's warmth. Each morning, we have found the snow figure in a new location, always farther from the chapel, always moving toward the house itself. And each time, it has grown more detailed, more lifelike in its appearance. This morning, it stood at the edge of our formal gardens, not 20 yards from the main house. The servants are frightened, Mr. Holmes. They speak of old legends, of golems and snow demons, of ancient compacts made by our ancestors. Some have already left our service, unwilling to remain at Pemberton Hall while this mystery unfolds. She gathered the velvet cloth around the figurine once more, her movements careful, almost reverent. I am not a superstitious woman, Mr. Holmes. I was educated in Switzerland. I have travelled extensively. I pride myself on rational thought. But I confess that I cannot explain what is happening at my home, and the prospect of spending Christmas Eve with this unknown presence, drawing ever nearer, fills me with a dread I cannot entirely dismiss. Holmes rose from his chair in one fluid movement, his restless energy temporarily contained by the narrow confines of our sitting room. He began to pace, his footsteps soft upon the carpet, his mind already working through the puzzle that had been laid before him. "You have brought the figurine to London rather than leave it at the Hall," he observed. "A wise precaution, perhaps, though it suggests you believe removing it might halt whatever process has been set in motion. I thought it best to place it in your hands, Mr. Holmes. If anyone can unravel this mystery, it is you, and I confess I was reluctant to spend another night under the same roof with the thing." The detective nodded slowly, still pacing, his fingers drumming against his leg in that absent rhythm that indicated deep thought. "Tell me, Lady Pemberton, has anything else unusual occurred at the Hall in recent weeks? Any visitors? Any discoveries? Any alterations to the property?" She considered this carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Now that you mention it, yes. 3 weeks ago, workmen were repairing the foundations of the old chapel. The ground had subsided somewhat, threatening the structural integrity of what remains. During their excavations, they uncovered a small chamber beneath the chapel floor, previously unknown. It was empty, save for some medieval stonework, and what appeared to be the remnants of very old texts, too deteriorated to read. We sealed the chamber again after ensuring the foundations were secure." "Ah," Holmes said softly, and I recognized that particular intonation, that quiet syllable that indicated a connection had been made in his vast mental archive. He moved to the window once more, gazing out at the snow-covered street. Holmes remained motionless at the window for several heartbeats, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass, merging with the falling snow beyond, until he seemed almost a figure of winter himself. When he spoke again, his voice carried that distant quality that indicated his mind had already travelled far from our warm sitting room, following threads of reasoning into darker, older places. "The timing is significant," he said, turning back to face our visitor. "The chamber discovered, the tradition continued, the figure's animation commencing precisely 3 weeks after the excavation. Lady Pemberton, I must ask you a question that may seem unusual. In the chamber beneath the chapel, did the workmen disturb anything beyond the earth itself? Move any stones, break any seals, however small?" Lady Pemberton's fingers tightened around the velvet bundle. "Thomas mentioned that one of the men had pried loose a cornerstone to inspect the foundation. Beneath it, they found a space, a hollow that had been deliberately created. It contained only fragments of what might once have been parchment or vellum, crumbled to dust at the slightest touch, and a residue of some crystalline substance that dissolved when exposed to air." "A hollow space," Holmes repeated, his eyes narrowing. "Sealed deliberately, and within it, materials that could not withstand exposure to the elements after centuries of protection. Yes, this begins to form a picture, though a strange one indeed." He moved to his desk, where various papers and monographs lay scattered in what appeared to be chaos, but which I knew to be his own peculiar system of organization. His long fingers sorted through the pile with practiced efficiency, until he withdrew a slim volume bound in faded leather. The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the whisper of turning pages and the soft settling of coals in the grate. I refilled Lady Pemberton's teacup, the warm liquid amber in the firelight, and she accepted it with a grateful nod. Outside, a carriage passed slowly through the snow, its wheels muffled, the driver's call to his horse barely audible through the thick window panes. "Ah," Holmes murmured after several minutes, his finger tracing a line of dense text. "Listen to this, Watson. In the parish of Great Wymondley, the family of Pemberton maintained certain observances dating to the return of Sir Edmund Pemberton from the Holy Land in the year 1273. Having witnessed practices of Eastern mysticism and brought back with him certain objects of power, Sir Edmund is said to have made a compact with the spirit of winter, binding it to protect his lands in exchange for yearly tribute and recognition. The form of this tribute involved the creation of a snow figure fashioned in the spirit's likeness, into which was pressed a token of acknowledgement, described in fragmentary sources as a stone of pale green alabaster, carved in the shape of a guardian. Lady Pemberton had gone very still, her face pale in the gaslight. "My family never spoke of such things in literal terms," she said quietly. The tradition was simply that, a tradition, like hanging mistletoe or singing carols, a quaint medieval custom kept alive for historical interest. Holmes closed the book gently, setting it aside with deliberate care. And yet, traditions persist for reasons, Lady Pemberton. They are the memory of peoples and places, preserved not in written words that can burn or fade, but in actions repeated, generation upon generation. What begins as necessity may become ritual. What starts as covenant may transform into custom, but the bones of truth often remain, buried beneath the accumulated snow of centuries. He reached out then, for the first time, toward the velvet-wrapped bundle. Lady Pemberton hesitated only a moment before placing it in his hands. Holmes unwrapped it slowly, revealing once more the pale figurine with its strange inner luminescence. In the firelight, it seemed to pulse gently, as though containing a heartbeat of its own. "Remarkable," Holmes breathed, turning it carefully in his long fingers. The craftsmanship is indeed medieval, possibly earlier. The stone is not alabaster, as Blackwood suggests, but rather a variety of serpentine, which would account for its greenish cast and its peculiar thermal properties. Serpentine has been associated with protective and spiritual purposes since ancient times, valued for its supposed ability to ward off evil influences and maintain connection between the physical and spiritual realms. I leaned closer to observe the artifact, noting how Holmes's fingers seemed almost reluctant to maintain prolonged contact with its surface. "It is remarkably cold," I observed, "far colder than seems natural, even accounting for its exposure to winter weather." "Precisely, Watson. The molecular structure of serpentine allows it to retain cold with unusual efficiency. But this goes beyond mere thermal retention. There is something else at work here, something, I confess, I do not yet fully understand." A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, sending a draught through the room that made the gaslight flicker and dance. The fire responded with a burst of renewed vigour, flames leaping higher as though startled into activity. Holmes set the figurine carefully upon his desk, where it sat like a small sentinel, watching us with its serene, carved gaze. "Lady Pemberton," Holmes said, his tone becoming brisk and decisive, "I shall take your case. More than that, I propose that Watson and I accompany you back to Pemberton Hall this very night. Whatever is transpiring there, it seems to be approaching some form of culmination, and I would prefer to observe the phenomenon directly, rather than rely solely upon second-hand reports." Our visitor's relief was palpable, her shoulders relaxing as though a weight had been lifted. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You cannot know how much comfort your agreement brings me. My carriage waits below, and the driver assures me that the roads north remain passable, though the snow continues." I rose immediately, moving to gather my medical bag and travelling coat, the prospect of adventure quickening my pulse despite the late hour and inclement weather. Holmes was already in motion, selecting items from his desk and chemical bench with swift precision, his movements economical and purposeful. "Mrs. Hudson," he called toward the door, his voice carrying down the stairs, "would you be so kind as to prepare a travelling basket? We shall be away for several days, I expect." The sound of our landlady's acknowledgement drifted up from below, followed by the comforting clatter of domestic preparation. Holmes wrapped the stone figurine carefully in its velvet cloth, before placing it within a small wooden box lined with felt, which he then secured within his travelling case. "Watson," he said as he shrugged into his heavy ulster coat, "I suggest you bring your revolver. I do not anticipate violence, but we venture into unknown territory, and it is best to be prepared for any eventuality." I nodded, checking the chambers of my service revolver before tucking it into my coat pocket, the familiar weight reassuring against my side. Lady Pemberton watched these preparations with an expression that mingled hope and apprehension, her hands clasped tightly before her. Within a quarter hour, we descended into the snowy street, where Lady Pemberton's enclosed carriage waited, its lamps glowing warmly in the winter darkness. The driver, a sturdy fellow wrapped in multiple layers against the cold, touched his hat respectfully as we approached. The horse, a strong bay gelding, stamped and snorted, its breath creating clouds of vapour in the frigid air. Holmes paused before entering the carriage, tilting his face upward to receive the falling snow. His eyes closed for a moment, as though listening to something beyond ordinary hearing. When he opened them again, they held that fierce light of intellectual pursuit that I had come to know so well. "The game is afoot, Watson," he murmured, so quietly that only I could hear. "Though what game and what rules govern it remains to be discovered." We settled into the carriage's cushioned interior, Lady Pemberton sitting across from us, her face half shadowed in the lamplight that swung gently from its brass hook. The driver's call rang out clear and sharp. The horse leaned into its harness, and we began to move through London's snow-draped streets, leaving behind the familiar comfort of Baker Street for whatever mysteries awaited us in the winter darkness of Hertfordshire. The wheels crunched through fresh snow, finding the cobblestones beneath with steady rhythm. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon something beyond the carriage windows. I knew better than to interrupt his reflections, so I turned my attention outward, watching as the city slowly gave way to suburbs, and suburbs in turn yielded to open countryside. The snow fell steadily, transforming the landscape into a realm of soft shadows and pale expanses, each tree and hedgerow rendered mysterious by its white burden. The rhythmic sway of the carriage became a kind of meditation, a gentle rocking that blurred the boundary between waking and dreaming as we travelled, deeming as we travelled deeper into the Hertfordshire countryside. Time seemed to lose its ordinary meaning in that enclosed space, where lamplight created a small island of warmth against the vast darkness beyond our windows, and the muffled sound of hoofbeats on snow marked our passage, like the ticking of some great clock, measuring out the minutes until we reached our destination. I found my thoughts drifting as I watched the winter landscape unfold through glass that had begun to frost at its edges, delicate patterns of ice forming fern-like shapes that caught and refracted the lamplight. The snow had lessened somewhat, though it had not ceased entirely, and now it fell in lazy spirals, individual flakes, large enough to track with the eye as they descended from the darkness above into the pale glow cast by our carriage lamps. Holmes remained absorbed in his own contemplations, occasionally murmuring to himself in that half-audible way that indicated he was constructing and testing theories, building mental architectures of possibility and probability. Lady Pemberton had succumbed to exhaustion, her head tilted against the cushioned wall of the carriage, her breathing slow and even in sleep. I drew a travelling blanket over her shoulders, tucking it gently around her against the cold that crept in through the inevitable gaps in the carriage's weatherproofing. Beyond our small sphere of light and warmth, England slept beneath its blanket of snow. We passed through villages where windows glowed amber with hearth fires, where smoke rose straight in the still air from countless chimneys, where the shapes of cottages and churches stood like illustrations from a child's storybook. Once, we overtook a farmer walking beside his cart, his lantern swinging in rhythm with his steps, and he raised a hand in greeting as we passed, a gesture of human connection in the winter solitude. The motion of the carriage, the gentle creaking of its springs and frame, the soft jingle of harness, all combined into a kind of symphony of travel, soothing in its predictability. I felt my own eyelids growing heavy, the warmth of the carriage and the lateness of the hour conspiring to pull me towards sleep. But each time I began to drift, some small change would recall me to wakefulness. A shift in the road's surface, the driver's low call to the horse, the sudden flight of a night bird startled from its roost. Holmes stirred, reaching into his coat to withdraw a small notebook and pencil. By the wavering lamplight, he began to sketch, his hand moving with swift certainty across the page. Curious, I leaned slightly to observe his work and saw that he was drawing the stone figurine from memory, adding notes in his precise script around the margins of the sketch. "The proportions are significant," he murmured, aware of my attention. "The ratio of head to body, the positioning of the hands, the angle of the gaze. These are not arbitrary choices, but deliberate symbolism, a language of form that would have been understood by those versed in medieval mystical traditions." "You believe there is genuine supernatural activity at work?" I asked quietly, mindful of Lady Pemberton's sleep. Holmes's expression in the lamplight was thoughtful, almost troubled. "I believe, Watson, that there are forces in this world that do not yield easily to rational analysis. Whether we term them supernaturals or simply natural phenomena, not yet fully understood by science, is perhaps a matter of semantics. What concerns me more immediately is the pattern we observe, a tradition interrupted, a seal broken, a protective compact potentially violated. If there is intelligence at work here, whether human or otherwise, it is following rules of its own devising, and we must discover those rules if we are to address the situation effectively." He closed the notebook, returning it to his pocket, and turned his attention to the window. "We are close now," he observed. "The landscape has changed. See how the trees grow more densely, how the walls along the road are built of older stone, how the very character of the land suggests age and long habitation." Indeed, as I looked more carefully, I could perceive the truth of his words. The countryside through which we now travelled had a different quality, a sense of deep history written in the curves of the land, in the ancient hedgerows and the weathered monuments that stood at crossroads, marking boundaries far older than any living memory. The carriage began to slow, and the driver's voice called out, announcing our approach to Pemberton Hall. Lady Pemberton woke with a start, her hand going immediately to her throat, as though reaching for something that was not there. She oriented herself quickly, smoothing her travelling cloak and peering out into the darkness. "We are arrived," she said softly, and there was both relief and apprehension in her voice. The carriage turned between two tall stone pillars, each topped with the carved figure of a griffin, weathered by centuries of rain and wind and snow, until their features had become suggestions rather than details. The drive curved through parkland, where great trees stood sentinel, their branches heavy with snow, their shadows deep and mysterious in the limited light of our lamps. Then the house itself came into view, and I caught my breath at the sight of it. Pemberton Hall rose from the snowy landscape like something from a medieval romance, its ancient stones glowing pale in the darkness, its many windows reflecting our approach in their dark glass. The original medieval structure was still evident in the central tower, and the chapel ruins visible to one side, but successive generations had added wings and improvements, creating a harmonious blend of architectural periods that spoke of continuous habitation across the centuries. But it was not the house that immediately commanded our attention. There, upon the broad lawn between the drive and the main entrance, stood the snow figure. Even from a distance, even in the uncertain light, it was clear that this was no ordinary snowman shaped by children's hands. The figure stood at least 8 feet tall, its proportions unnaturally perfect, its form detailed with a precision that seemed impossible to achieve in such a medium. It faced the house directly, its featureless face, if face it could be called, turned toward the glowing windows as though keeping watch. The carriage drew to a halt before the main entrance, and a servant hurried out to open the door and lower the steps, his face pinched with cold and something that might have been fear. As we descended, the snow crunching beneath our boots, I felt the temperature drop perceptibly, as though we had stepped into a pocket of deeper winter. Holmes moved immediately toward the snow figure, his stride purposeful, despite the uncertain footing. Lady Pemberton and I followed, while servants began to gather at the house's entrance, their forms silhouetted against the warm light spilling from within. As we drew closer to the figure, details emerged that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle, despite my medical training and rational mind. The snow had been shaped with impossible finesse, creating folds and curves that suggested fabric draped over a human form. The hands, extended slightly from the body, showed individual fingers of startling clarity. And where a face should be, there was instead a smooth oval that somehow conveyed expression through its very lack of features, an impression of patient waiting, of ancient purpose, of attention focused with inhuman intensity upon the house before it. Holmes circled the figure slowly, his sharp eyes missing nothing, his gloved hand occasionally reaching out to touch the snow with clinical precision. Fascinating, he breathed, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the nearby trees. Watson, observe the base. There is no accumulation of fallen snow around its feet, as though it has only recently arrived at this position. And yet, the ground shows no tracks, no disturbance whatsoever. I looked where he indicated, and saw the truth of his observation. The snow around the figure was pristine, unmarked, as though the thing had simply materialized in place rather than being built or moved by physical means. A sound from the house drew our attention, a door opening, footsteps approaching. An elderly man appeared, his face weathered and lined with years of outdoor work, his eyes troubled as they fixed upon the snow figure. "Mr. Holmes, I presume," he said, his voice rough but respectful. "I'm Thomas, her ladyship's groundskeeper. I'm that glad you've come, sir. This business has gone beyond anything I can understand or manage." Holmes turned to face him, his expression keen with interest. "You created the original figure, I understand. Tell me, Thomas, in precise detail if you please, exactly how it appeared when you first built it, and how it has changed with each passing night. The old groundskeeper's gaze shifted to the figure, and in his eyes I saw a mixture of wonder and dread. When I built it 3 nights past, sir, it was simple enough. 7 feet tall, rough-shaped like a man, with the traditional symbols carved into its chest, as has been done since my grandfather's time, and his grandfather's before him. Nothing more than packed snow, sir, formed by these hands and no others. He held up his gnarled hands as though offering evidence. The next morning it had moved 20 paces toward the house and had begun to take on more detail. The morning after that, another 20 paces closer, and more refined still. This morning I found it here, and now it looks as you see it, more like a statue carved by a master than anything shaped from snow. And there's something else, Mr. Holmes, something that frightens me more than all the rest. Yes, Holmes prompted gently. It's growing warmer, sir. When I touched it this morning, it was cold as you'd expect, but not the bone-deep cold it had before. It's as though the snow is becoming something else, something that holds warmth rather than cold, as though it's becoming alive. The wind chose that moment to gust more strongly, sending snow devils spiraling across the lawn, causing the branches of nearby trees to creak and groan under their white burden. And I could have sworn, though perhaps it was merely a trick of the uncertain light, that the snow figure's smooth oval of a face turned slightly, as though acknowledging our presence, as though aware that we had come to unravel its mystery. Thomas's words hung in the cold air like visible breath, and for a long moment none of us spoke. None of us spoke, the weight of his revelation settling over us with the same quiet inevitability as the falling snow. Holmes stood perfectly still, his profile sharp against the pale expanse of the snowy lawn, and I recognized in his stillness not uncertainty, but rather that intense focus that preceded his most brilliant deductions, as though he were listening to voices the rest of us could not hear, reading messages written in a language beyond ordinary comprehension. The house beckoned with its warm promise of shelter, its windows glowing like amber jewels set into ancient stone, and Lady Pemberton gestured toward the entrance with a hand that trembled only slightly. "Gentlemen, please come inside. You must be chilled to the bone after your journey, and there are things I should show you, documents and family records that may prove useful to your investigation." We followed her across the threshold into a great entrance hall that spoke of centuries of careful stewardship and quiet wealth. The floor was laid with black and white marble tiles, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and the walls rose 2 stories to a ceiling, adorned with elaborate plasterwork depicting scenes of medieval life, knights and ladies, hunts and harvests, all rendered with that peculiar mixture of naivety and sophistication, characteristic of 16th century craftsmanship. A fire burned in a massive stone fireplace that could have accommodated an entire tree trunk, its flames casting dancing shadows that animated the ancestral portraits hanging in their heavy gilt frames. Servants moved quietly about their duties, though I noticed how their eyes kept straying toward the windows that faced the lawn, toward the spot where the snow figure stood its patient vigil. A young maid took our coats and hats, her movements efficient, but her face pale with poorly concealed anxiety. An older butler, straight-backed despite his years, approached with a silver tray bearing glasses of warmed brandy, which we accepted gratefully, the spirits spreading welcome heat through our cold, stiffened limbs. "Thomas," Holmes said, turning to the groundskeeper who had followed us inside, and now stood somewhat awkwardly in the grand space, clearly more comfortable in his outdoor domain than amid such finery. "Before we examine any documents, I should like to see the chapel and the excavation site. Would you be kind enough to guide us there?" The old man nodded, though his expression suggested he would rather avoid that particular location. "Aye, Mr. Holmes, though it's full dark now, and the way is treacherous with snow. Nonetheless, I believe it essential to examine the site while impressions are fresh and before any further changes occur." Holmes turned to Lady Pemberton. "With your permission, of course." "By all means, Mr. Holmes. Thomas, please provide the gentlemen with whatever assistance they require. I shall have rooms prepared for you both, and a late supper laid out for when you return. Dr. Watson, should you prefer to warm yourself first?" "I thank you for your consideration, Lady Pemberton," I interjected, "but I have accompanied Holmes through far worse conditions than a winter's night in Hertfordshire. I shall go with him." She smiled, a flash of warmth that momentarily dispelled the tension that had settled over the household. "I suspected as much. You are most welcome at Pemberton Hall, both of you. Take lanterns from the scullery, and Thomas, mind you bring them back safely. The chapel ruins can be dangerous even in daylight." Thus, equipped with sturdy lanterns and our coats restored to our shoulders, Holmes and I followed Thomas back out into the winter night, leaving the warmth and light of the house behind. The snow had stopped falling at last, and the clouds were beginning to break apart overhead, revealing glimpses of stars scattered across the vast darkness like diamonds on black velvet. Our lanterns cast pools of golden light that swayed with our movements, illuminating the path Thomas led us along, around the side of the great house, and through what in summer must be elaborate formal gardens, but which now lay sleeping beneath their white coverlet. Our boots crunched through snow that had drifted against hedges and settled into the curves of empty fountains, and our breath created small clouds that dissipated almost instantly in the frigid air. The chapel ruins materialized gradually from the darkness, first as a darker shadow against the star-pricked sky, then as distinct forms, broken walls rising jagged against the heavens, empty windows that had once held stained glass now framing only night and stars, a partially collapsed roof through which moonlight was beginning to stream as the clouds continued their retreat. It must have been a beautiful structure once, this chapel, built in that early English Gothic style, with its pointed arches and elaborate stone tracery. But time and weather, and perhaps deliberate destruction, during the dissolution of the monasteries, had reduced it to this romantic skeleton. "Here, sir," Thomas said, raising his lantern to illuminate a section of floor near what would have been the altar. "This is where we found the subsidence, and here is where we excavated." The stones had been carefully replaced after the repairs, but it was still possible to see where mortar had been freshly applied, pale against the weathered darkness of the medieval masonry. Holmes knelt beside the spot, setting his lantern down with care, running his gloved fingers over the stones with that delicate touch that could discern information invisible to less trained senses. "The cornerstone that was removed," he said, without looking up. "Show me which one it was." Thomas pointed to a larger stone set at the junction of floor and wall, a piece perhaps 18 inches square, carved with a simple cross within a circle. "That one, Mr. Holmes. When we pried it up to inspect the foundation beneath, that's when we found the hollow space. Holmes produced a small magnifying glass from his pocket, and despite the uncertain lantern light, he examined the stone's edges minutely, his breath creating small clouds of condensation as he worked. I stood guard, as it were, my hand resting unconsciously on the revolver in my pocket, though what threat I imagined might manifest in these ancient ruins, I could not have said. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through the broken walls and the distant call of an owl hunting over the snow-covered fields. Then Holmes sat back on his heels with a small sound of satisfaction. "Interesting," he murmured. "Watson, bring your lantern closer, if you would. Observe here, along the edge of the stone." I knelt beside him, holding my lantern where he indicated, and saw what his keen eyes had detected. A series of marks carved into the edge of the stone, so small and so carefully hidden that they would be invisible unless one knew precisely where to look. "Letters," I said, peering more closely, "or symbols of some kind." "Latin," Holmes confirmed, "much worn by time, but still legible to one who knows what to seek. Hic jacet pactum inter mortalem et eterna frigoris. Here lies the compact between mortal and eternal cold." A gust of wind, stronger than before, swept through the ruins, causing our lanterns to flicker wildly. And from somewhere in the darkness beyond our small circles of light came a sound, a crack, sharp and clear, like ice breaking under pressure. Thomas started violently, his lantern swinging as he turned to peer into the shadows. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. Holmes rose smoothly to his feet, his head cocked in an attitude of intense listening. "From the direction of the house," he said quietly. "Come, we must return immediately." We hurried back along the path we had come, our lanterns bobbing wildly, creating mad shadows that leaped and danced across the snow. As we rounded the corner of the house, the front lawn came into view, and we stopped abruptly, all three of us transfixed by what we saw. The snow figure had moved again. It now stood at the base of the steps leading to the main entrance, its smooth face turned upward toward the house's facade, its arms slightly raised as though in supplication or greeting. And even from where we stood, even in the uncertain light of our lanterns and the emerging moon, we could see that it had changed yet again, had become even more refined, more detailed, more disturbingly lifelike in its proportions and posture. But that was not what held us frozen in shock and wonder. Around the figure's feet, radiating outward in a perfect circle, the snow had melted, revealing the dark earth beneath. Steam rose from the exposed ground in visible wisps, curling upward into the cold air like smoke from unseen fires. "Dear God," Thomas breathed, and his lantern trembled in his shaking hand. Holmes moved forward with swift purpose, approaching the figure with caution, but without apparent fear, his scientific curiosity overriding whatever alarm he might feel. I followed close behind, my medical training warring with a more primitive instinct that urged me to maintain distance from this impossible thing. As we drew near, the temperature changed perceptibly, the bitter cold of the winter night giving way to something altogether stranger. Not warmth exactly, but rather an absence of cold, a neutral zone where winter's grip seemed to have been suspended. Holmes reached out toward the figure, his hand hovering inches from its surface, and I saw his expression shift, his eyes widening with an emotion I rarely witnessed in my friend's usually impassive features. genuine astonishment. "It is warm," he said softly, his voice carrying a note of wonder that bordered on reverence. "Not merely absent of cold, Watson, but actively warm to the touch. The molecular structure of the snow is being altered at a fundamental level, transformed into something that retains heat rather than disperses it." He withdrew his hand, and I saw that moisture glistened on his gloves' fingertips, the snow having partially melted at even that brief contact. "This is no mere atmospheric phenomenon," he continued, speaking more to himself than to us. "This is transformation, transubstantiation, the crossing of boundaries between states of matter and perhaps states of being." A window opened above us, and Lady Pemberton's voice called down, edged with alarm. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, what is happening?" "I suggest, Lady Pemberton," Holmes called back, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air, "that you gather your household in the main hall and keep them there until further notice. What we are witnessing may be approaching its culmination, and I would prefer all inhabitants of the house to remain together and within sight." "At once, Mr. Holmes." The window closed, and through it we could see movement within, shadows passing as servants hurried to comply with Holmes's instruction. Holmes stood motionless, his gaze fixed upon the figure with an intensity that seemed almost to rival its own patient regard of the house. I could see the calculations moving behind his eyes, the theories forming and reforming as he incorporated each new observation into his expanding understanding of the phenomenon before us. The steam continued to rise from the circle of exposed earth, creating a boundary as clear as any drawn line. And within that circle, grass showed green and living, as though spring had arrived in this one small space, while all around winter maintained its dominion. "Thomas," Holmes said at length, his voice calm despite the strangeness of our situation, "in your grandfather's time, in the stories passed down through your family regarding this tradition, was there ever mention of the snow figure taking on properties such as we now observe, of movement, of warmth, of apparent animation?" The old groundskeeper shook his head slowly, his weathered face troubled in the moonlight. "Nothing like this, sir. The stories spoke only of building the figure each year, of pressing into it a token, though in my grandfather's day they had lost the original token and used instead a smooth river stone marked with a cross. The figure would stand through the 12 days of Christmas and then melt naturally when warmer weather came. That was all, sir, just a tradition, like putting up the Yule log or hanging holly over the doors. But 3 weeks ago, when the chamber beneath the chapel was opened, something changed," Holmes mused. "A seal was broken, a protection removed, or perhaps—" He paused, his eyes narrowing in thought. Perhaps a summons was issued, a call that had been silenced for centuries suddenly permitted to sound once more. He turned to face the house, where lights now blazed from every window on the ground floor, and figures could be seen moving within, servants and family gathering as he had requested. "Come, gentlemen, I believe we have learned all we can from external observation. It is time to delve into the historical record, to understand what compact was made and what obligations may have been left unfulfilled." We mounted the steps to the entrance, passing within arm's reach of the snow figure, and I confess that my skin prickled with an almost electrical sensation as we drew near it, as though the air itself had become charged with some force beyond ordinary meteorology. The door opened before we could knock, and we were ushered into the warmth and light of the entrance hall, where Lady Pemberton stood surrounded by her household staff, perhaps a dozen souls in all, their faces ranging from curious to frightened, all marked by the uncertainty that had settled over Pemberton Hall like its blanket of snow. "Mr. Holmes," Lady Pemberton began, her composure admirable, though her hands betrayed her tension by the way they twisted the fabric of her gown. "The staff are assembled as you requested. Several have asked if they might be permitted to leave for the village until this matter is resolved." Holmes surveyed the gathered faces with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beyond mere surface appearances, reading character and truth in the subtle signs most people overlooked. "I would not recommend anyone venturing out tonight," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, yet somehow managing to remain gentle. "Whatever is transpiring here, I believe it will reach its conclusion before dawn. To be caught out of doors when that moment arrives might prove inadvisable." A young footman, barely out of boyhood, spoke up with admirable courage despite the tremor in his voice. "Begging your pardon, sir, but is it true what Thomas says, that the Snowman is alive?" "Alive is perhaps too simple a word for what it is," Holmes replied, and I heard in his voice that quality of the teacher, the desire to enlighten rather than merely inform. "But it is certainly more than simple snow shaped by human hands. Think of it perhaps as a vessel, empty for many years, but now being filled with purpose and presence. Whether that presence is benevolent or malevolent remains to be determined." Lady Pemberton gestured toward a doorway that led deeper into the house. "I have had the library prepared for your use, Mr. Holmes. The family papers are extensive, dating back to the 14th century in some cases. I confess I have never examined them thoroughly. Such documents seemed merely historical curiosities until now." The library proved to be a magnificent room, 2 stories in height, with galleries running along 3 walls and reached by a graceful spiral staircase of dark oak. Books lined every available space, their leather bindings creating a tapestry of browns and burgundies and forest greens. And the air held that particular scent of old paper and aging leather that speaks of accumulated knowledge and preserved memory. A fire had been built in the marble fireplace, and candelabras had been lit on several reading tables, their flames adding to the warm glow that made this space feel like a sanctuary against the winter darkness beyond the tall windows. "The oldest documents are kept in the cabinet there." Lady Pemberton indicated a massive piece of furniture carved from blackened oak, its doors secured with an ancient lock. "I shall fetch the key." While she was gone, Holmes began to pace the library's length, his eyes roaming over the shelves, occasionally pausing to examine a particular volume. I settled into a leather armchair near the fire, grateful for its warmth after our time in the cold, and found myself watching the windows, half expecting to see a smooth oval face pressed against the glass, observing us with that patient, inhuman attention. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, "what do you make of all this from a medical perspective? Is there any natural explanation for snow that generates heat, for a form that moves without apparent physical agency?" I considered carefully before answering, marshalling what knowledge I possessed of chemistry and physics. I know that certain chemical reactions can generate heat, and that some substances undergo phase changes that release energy. But snow is simply frozen water, and I know of no mechanism by which it could spontaneously reverse its thermal properties. As for movement without agency— I paused, shaking my head. I confess myself at a loss, Holmes. Everything I observe defies rational explanation. And yet, there must be an explanation, Holmes insisted, though his tone lacked its usual certainty. Whether the mechanism is natural or supernatural, and I begin to think that distinction may be less meaningful than I had previously supposed. There are rules at work here, patterns and purposes that can be understood if we gather sufficient data. Lady Pemberton returned, carrying an iron key nearly the length of her hand, blackened with age and use. She unlocked the cabinet with some effort, the mechanism protesting after what might have been years without use, and the doors swung open to reveal shelves laden with leather-bound volumes and wooden boxes containing loose papers. "I scarce know where to begin," she admitted, surveying the accumulation of centuries. "These documents have been preserved by tradition rather than organization. Each generation simply adds its own records to the collection." Holmes approached the cabinet with the reverence of a scholar entering a great archive. His fingers traced along the spines of the volumes, pausing occasionally to withdraw one and examine its contents by candlelight. "Here," he said, after several minutes of searching, drawing forth a volume bound in cracked leather, its pages brittle with age. "A household account book from the late 13th century, if I'm reading the script correctly. Let us see what expenditures were deemed worthy of record in those days." He carried the volume to the nearest table, where the candlelight was brightest, and began to turn the pages with infinite care, his lips moving slightly as he translated the archaic Latin into English. I rose and moved to stand beside him, peering over his shoulder at the spidery script that covered the yellowed pages. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, his finger tracing a particular entry. "Here, in December of 1273, we find an unusual expenditure. For the carving of a protective figure in stone of serpent, 40 shillings. For the services of Brother Aldrich in the binding of same, 20 shillings. For the construction of a sealed chamber beneath the chapel floor, £10. These were enormous sums for that period, Watson, representing months of the estate's income. He turned more pages, his excitement growing as more details emerged. And here, a notation in different hand, added perhaps a year later. The compact is sealed, the guardian bound, the price agreed. Each year on the eve of Christ's birth, we shall raise the snow figure and press within it the token of acknowledgement. So long as this is done, the guardian shall watch over Pemberton lands, and no winter's cruelty shall prevail against us. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks that crackled and popped, and the candles flickered as though disturbed by a draught, though all the windows remained firmly closed. Lady Pemberton had gone quite pale, one hand pressed against her throat. "Then it is true," she whispered. "The legends, the stories, they were not merely folklore, but actual history." Holmes looked up from the ancient volume, his expression grave. "It would appear so, Lady Pemberton. Your ancestor made a bargain with something, bound it to service through ritual and sacrifice. Though what he gave in return, or what consequences might follow should the compact be violated, remains unclear." He returned to the cabinet, searching now with greater urgency, withdrawing documents and examining them rapidly before setting them aside or carrying them to the growing pile on the table. Holmes's hands moved through the ancient documents with practiced efficiency, each yellowed page yielding its secrets to his penetrating gaze. each fragment of faded ink contributing to the mosaic of understanding. He was constructing piece by careful piece. The library had taken on the quality of a sanctuary in time, the world beyond its walls seeming distant and unreal, while here, among the accumulated knowledge of centuries, truth waited to be uncovered like treasure buried beneath layers of forgotten years. I watched him work, marveling, as I always did, at the peculiar mixture of patience and intensity he brought to such research, the way he could lose himself completely in the pursuit of knowledge while simultaneously maintaining an awareness of everything occurring around him. Lady Pemberton had settled into a chair near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed, but her eyes reflecting the worry that gnawed at her peace of mind. Minutes stretched into an hour, measured by the soft ticking of a long case clock standing in one corner and the occasional settling of coals in the grate. Holmes moved between the cabinet and the table, creating piles of documents organized according to some system comprehensible only to himself, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook with that same meticulous care he applied to all his endeavors. Then, quite suddenly, he froze, his hand hovering over a sheet of parchment, so old it had turned the color of strong tea, its edges crumbling with the weight of centuries. I saw his expression change, saw understanding dawn in his eyes, like sunrise breaking over a darkened landscape. "Here," he breathed, the single word carrying volumes of significance. "Watson, Lady Pemberton, come and see this." We gathered around the table as he carefully smoothed the parchment, his touch gentle lest the fragile material disintegrate entirely. The script was in Latin, ornate and formal, clearly written by a practiced hand, perhaps that of a monk or educated clerk. Holmes began to translate, his voice low and measured as he rendered the ancient words into modern English. "In the year of our Lord 1273, I, Edmund Pemberton, knight, having returned from the Holy Land bearing wounds both visible and invisible, do set down this account so that my descendants may know the nature of the compact I have made, and the obligations that now bind our house. In the deserts beyond Jerusalem, I encountered one who appeared as a man, but who was not mortal, who called himself Malekith, and claimed dominion over winter's realm. He offered protection for my lands, abundance in lean years, safety from winter's worst cruelties, asking in return only recognition and remembrance." Holmes paused, his finger tracing the next lines with increased concentration. "The terms are thus: each year upon Christmas Eve, as the sun sets, we shall construct a figure of snow in the form of a man, in dimensions and proportions I have specified in the accompanying diagrams. Into this figure we shall press the token of binding, the stone of serpent carved with Malekith's seal, which I have brought with me from that distant land. The figure shall stand for the 12 days of Christmas, and through it Malekith shall walk our lands, observing, protecting, renewing the compact. On the 12th day the figure shall melt naturally, and Malekith shall return to his realm until the cycle comes again." Lady Pemberton drew in a sharp breath, her hand clutching at the back of a nearby chair. "The stone," she whispered. "The stone I brought to Baker Street. That is the token of binding." "Indeed," Holmes confirmed, looking up from the parchment. "And when it was removed from the chamber beneath the chapel, when the seal that had contained it was broken, and it was carried away from Pemberton Hall, the compact was disrupted. The figure was raised as tradition demanded, but without the proper token pressed into it. It became not a vessel for Malekith to inhabit, but rather— He paused, his brow furrowing. A beacon, perhaps, a signal calling to him across whatever gulf separates his realm from ours. Then the figure's movement, I interjected, working through the implications. Its approach toward the house, its transformation from simple snow to something more substantial. All of this is Malekith responding to that call, attempting to complete the ritual that was interrupted. Precisely, Watson. And with each passing hour, the boundary between his realm and ours grows thinner, the passage easier. By bringing the token to London, we may inadvertently have created a situation far more dangerous than if it had remained at the hall, even improperly sealed. The long case clock chose that moment to chime the hour, its deep notes reverberating through the library, and I counted 11 strokes that seemed to echo in the chambers of my heart. 11 of the clock on Christmas Eve, with midnight drawing near, and with it, perhaps, the culmination of forces set in motion centuries ago, and now awakened by chance and ignorance. A sound from outside drew our attention to the windows, not loud, but distinct in the winter stillness. A creaking, like ice moving on a frozen pond, or perhaps like joints unused to movement being flexed after long dormancy. As one, we moved to the nearest window and looked out across the moonlit lawn. The snow figure had ascended the steps. It now stood directly before the main entrance, its arms no longer merely raised, but extended fully, its smooth face tilted upward as though gazing at the very windows through which we observed it. And as we watched, cracks appeared in its surface, fine lines spreading like a network of veins beneath skin. And from those cracks came not the darkness of hollow space, but rather a pale blue radiance, cold as starlight, ancient as winter itself. Dear God, Lady Pemberton breathed, and I heard in her voice the edge of terror kept barely in check by force of will. What have we done? What have I done by bringing that stone to London? Holmes turned from the window, his face set in lines of grim determination. You did what any rational person would do when confronted with inexplicable phenomena. You sought expert assistance. The fault, if fault there be, lies with those who broke the seal without understanding what they protected, and perhaps with those earlier generations who allowed the true nature of the compact to fade into legend and superstition. He strode to the table where his travelling case lay, and withdrew the wooden box containing the stone figurine. The question now is not one of blame, but of action. We have the token. We have knowledge of the compact. What we need is understanding of how to properly complete the ritual, to allow Malekith his recognition and observance, and thereby satisfy the terms of the agreement. He returned to the parchment, scanning it with renewed urgency, and I saw his eyes widen as they fell upon text near the bottom of the sheet. Ah, here, instructions for the ritual itself. When the figure is raised, let the master of the house approach at the setting of the sun on Christmas Eve, bearing the token. Let him press it into the figure's breast, speaking these words in the tongue of power. Holmes's voice trailed off as he examined what followed, a string of syllables in no language I recognized, harsh and sibilant, seeming to resist pronunciation by human tongue. Can you read it? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Read it, yes. Speak it correctly? He shook his head slowly. This is no Latin or Greek, no Hebrew or Arabic. This is something older, something that predates the languages of civilization. To speak it incorrectly might be worse than not speaking it at all. A louder crack echoed from outside, followed by what sounded disturbingly like footsteps, slow, deliberate, the sound of weight being shifted from foot to foot. We rushed back to the window and saw that the snow figure had moved again, was now pressed against the very door of the house, its radiant cracks spreading across its entire form until it seemed less a thing of snow and more a being of pure winter light, barely contained within a physical shell. The household staff had gathered in the entrance hall below us, their voices rising in alarm, and I heard Lady Pemberton gasp as she pressed closer to the window. "It will be inside within moments," she said, her voice surprisingly steady given the circumstances. "Mr. Holmes, whatever you intend to do, it must be done now." Holmes stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats, his brilliant mind racing through possibilities and probabilities, weighing risks and potential outcomes with that lightning calculation that had solved so many seemingly insoluble problems. Then his jaw set with decision. "Lady Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "I need you to assemble every member of your household in the Great Hall and keep them calm. Watson, you will accompany me. We are going to complete the ritual, and we are going to do it correctly, or, at the very least, close enough to correctly that it satisfies the entity that waits at your threshold." "But the words," I protested. "You said you couldn't be certain of pronouncing them." A thin smile touched his lips. That particular expression I had seen before, when he prepared to undertake some action that balanced on the knife edge between inspiration and madness. "I said I couldn't be certain, Watson, not that I wouldn't attempt it. Sometimes in this world, the choice is not between perfect action and flawed action, but between flawed action and no action at all. Come, bring your revolver if it gives you comfort, though I suspect it will prove quite useless against what we face." He gathered the parchment carefully, folding it and placing it within his coat, then retrieved the wooden box containing the stone figurine. Lady Pemberton hurried from the library to carry out his instructions, her footsteps quick upon the stairs, and Holmes and I stood for a moment in the quiet room, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages, preparing to face something that wisdom alone might not be sufficient to address. "Holmes," I said quietly, "are you quite certain about this course of action?" He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw not certainty, but rather courage, the willingness to proceed despite uncertainty, to act because action was required even when perfect knowledge remained elusive. "No, Watson, I am not certain, but I am resolved. Sometimes that must suffice." Together we descended the stairs, the sounds of the household gathering in the great hall growing louder as we approached. Voices raised in question and fear. Servants and family alike united in their shared apprehension. The front door stood before us, solid oak bound with iron, centuries old and built to withstand siege, yet somehow seeming fragile now against what pressed from the other side. Orchestrated narrative continuation with atmospheric tension and plot advancement. Holmes's hands moved through the ancient documents with practiced efficiency, each yellowed page yielding its secrets to his penetrating gaze, each fragment of faded ink contributing to the mosaic of understanding he was constructing piece by careful piece. The library had taken on the quality of a sanctuary in time, the world beyond its walls seeming distant and unreal. While here, among the accumulated knowledge of centuries, truth waited to be uncovered like treasure buried beneath layers of forgotten years. I watched him work, marveling as I always did at the peculiar mixture of patience and intensity he brought to such research, the way he could lose himself completely in the pursuit of knowledge while simultaneously maintaining an awareness of everything occurring around him. Lady Pemberton had settled into a chair near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed, but her eyes reflecting the worry that gnawed at her peace of mind. Minutes stretched into an hour, measured by the soft ticking of a long case clock standing in one corner and the occasional settling of coals in the grate. Holmes moved between the cabinet and the table, creating piles of documents, organized according to some system comprehensible only to himself, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook with that same meticulous care he applied to all his endeavours. Then, quite suddenly, he froze, his hand hovering over a sheet of parchment so old it had turned the colour of strong tea, its edges crumbling with the weight of centuries. I saw his expression change, saw understanding dawn in his eyes like sunrise breaking over a darkened landscape. Here, he breathed, the single word carrying volumes of significance. "Watson, Lady Pemberton, come and see this." We gathered around the table as he carefully smoothed the parchment, his touch gentle lest the fragile material disintegrate entirely. The script was in Latin, ornate and formal, clearly written by a practiced hand, perhaps that of a monk or educated clerk. Holmes began to translate, his voice low and measured as he rendered the ancient words into modern English. In the year of our Lord 1273, I, Edmund Pemberton, knight, having returned from the Holy Land, bearing wounds both visible and invisible, do set down this account, so that my descendants may know the nature of the compact I have made, and the obligations that now bind our house. In the deserts beyond Jerusalem, I encountered one who appeared as a man, but who was not mortal, who called himself Malekith, and claimed dominion over Winter's realm. He offered protection for my lands, abundance in lean years, safety from Winter's worst cruelties, asking in return only recognition and remembrance. Holmes paused, his finger tracing the next lines with increased concentration. The terms are thus: each year upon Christmas Eve, as the sun sets, we shall construct a figure of snow in the form of a man, in dimensions and proportions I have specified in the accompanying diagrams. Into this figure we shall press the token of binding, the stone of serpent carved with Malekith's seal, which I have brought with me from that distant land. The figure shall stand for the 12 days of Christmas, and through it Malekith shall walk our lands, observing, protecting, renewing the compact. On the 12th day, the figure shall melt naturally, and Malekith shall return to his realm until the cycle comes again. Lady Pemberton drew in a sharp breath, her hand clutching at the back of a nearby chair. "The stone," she whispered. "The stone I brought to Baker Street. That is the token of binding." "Indeed," Holmes confirmed, looking up from the parchment. "And when it was removed from the chamber beneath the chapel, when the seal that had contained it was broken and it was carried away from Pemberton Hall, the compact was disrupted. The figure was raised, as tradition demanded, but without the proper token pressed into it. It became not a vessel for Malekith to inhabit, but rather—" He paused, his brow furrowing. "A beacon, perhaps. A signal calling to him across whatever gulf separates his realm from ours. Then the figure's movement, I interjected, working through the implications. Its approach toward the house, its transformation from simple snow to something more substantial. All of this is Malekith responding to that call, attempting to complete the ritual that was interrupted. Precisely, Watson, and with each passing hour, the boundary between his realm and ours grows thinner, the passage easier. By bringing the token to London, we may inadvertently have created a situation far more dangerous than if it had remained at the hall, even improperly sealed. The long case clock chose that moment to chime the hour, its deep notes reverberating through the library, and I counted 11 strokes that seemed to echo in the chambers of my heart. 11 of the clock on Christmas Eve, with midnight drawing near, and with it, perhaps, the culmination of forces set in motion centuries ago, and now awakened by chance and ignorance. A sound from outside drew our attention to the windows, not loud, but distinct in the winter stillness. A creaking, like ice, moving on a frozen pond, or perhaps like joints unused to movement, being flexed after long dormancy. As one, we moved to the nearest window and looked out across the moonlit lawn. The snow figure had ascended the steps. It now stood directly before the main entrance, its arms no longer merely raised, but extended fully, its smooth face tilted upward as though gazing at the very windows through which we observed it. And as we watched, cracks appeared in its surface, fine lines spreading like a network of veins beneath skin. And from those cracks came not the darkness of hollow space, but rather a pale blue radiance, cold as starlight, ancient as winter itself. Dear God, Lady Pemberton breathed, and I heard in her voice the edge of terror kept barely in check by force of will. What have we done? What have I done by bringing that stone to London? Holmes turned from the window, his face set in lines of grim determination. You did what any rational person would do when confronted with inexplicable phenomena. You sought expert assistance. The fault, if fault there be, lies with those who broke the seal without understanding what they protected, and perhaps with those earlier generations who allowed the true nature of the compact to fade into legend and superstition. He strode to the table where his travelling case lay, and withdrew the wooden box containing the stone figurine. The question now is not one of blame, but of action. We have the token. We have knowledge of the compact. What we need is understanding of how to properly complete the ritual, to allow Malekith his recognition and observance, and thereby satisfy the terms of the agreement. He returned to the parchment, scanning it with renewed urgency, and I saw his eyes widen as they fell upon text near the bottom of the sheet. Ah, here, instructions for the ritual itself. When the figure is raised, let the master of the house approach at the setting of the sun on Christmas Eve, bearing the token. Let him press it into the figure's breast, speaking these words in the tongue of power. Holmes's voice trailed off as he examined what followed, a string of syllables in no language I recognized, harsh and sibilant, seeming to resist pronunciation by human tongue. Can you read it? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Read it, yes. Speak it correctly? He shook his head slowly. This is no Latin or Greek, no Hebrew or Arabic. This is something older, something that predates the languages of civilization. To speak it incorrectly might be worse than not speaking it at all. A louder crack echoed from outside, followed by what sounded disturbingly like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, the sound of weight being shifted from foot to foot. We rushed back to the window and saw that the snow figure had moved again, was now pressed against the very door of the house, its radiant cracks spreading across its entire form until it seemed less a thing of snow and more a being of pure winter light, barely contained within a physical shell. The household staff had gathered in the entrance hall below us, their voices rising in alarm, and I heard Lady Pemberton gasp as she pressed closer to the window. "It will be inside within moments," she said, her voice surprisingly steady given the circumstances. "Mr. Holmes, whatever you intend to do, it must be done now." Holmes stood perfectly still for 3 heartbeats, his brilliant mind racing through possibilities and probabilities, weighing risks and potential outcomes with that lightning calculation that had solved so many seemingly insoluble problems. Then his jaw set with decision. "Lady Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "I need you to assemble every member of your household in the great hall and keep them calm. Watson, you will accompany me. We are going to complete the ritual, and we are going to do it correctly, or at the very least, close enough to correctly that it satisfies the entity that waits at your threshold." "But the words," I protested. "You said you couldn't be certain of pronouncing them." A thin smile touched his lips, that particular expression I had seen before, when he prepared to undertake some action that balanced on the knife edge between inspiration and madness. "I said I couldn't be certain, Watson, not that I wouldn't attempt it. Sometimes in this world, the choice is not between perfect action and flawed action, but between flawed action and no action at all. Come, bring your revolver if it gives you comfort, though I suspect it will prove quite useless against what we face." He gathered the parchment carefully, folding it and placing it within his coat, then retrieved the wooden box containing the stone figurine. Lady Pemberton hurried from the library to carry out his instructions, her footsteps quick upon the stairs, and Holmes and I stood for a moment in the quiet room, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages, preparing to face something that wisdom alone might not be sufficient to address. "Holmes," I said quietly, "are you quite certain about this course of action?" He looked at me then, and in his eyes I saw not certainty, but rather courage, the willingness to proceed despite uncertainty, to act because action was required, even when perfect knowledge remained elusive. "No, Watson, I am not certain, but I am resolved. Sometimes that must suffice." Together we descended the stairs, the sounds of the household gathering in the great hall growing louder as we approached, voices raised in question and fear, servants and family alike united in their shared apprehension. The front door stood before us, solid oak bound with iron, centuries old and built to withstand siege, yet somehow seeming fragile now against what pressed from the other side. Holmes's hand closed around the iron handle of Thend, closed around the iron handle of the great door, his fingers steady despite the impossible nature of what we were about to attempt. And in that suspended moment, before he pulled the door open, I became acutely aware of every sound in the ancient house. The nervous breathing of the assembled household gathered behind us in the great hall, the crackle and pop of fires burning in their grates, the whisper of wind finding its way through gaps in the stone, and beneath it all, a deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. A vibration felt more than heard, as though the world held its breath in anticipation. The handle turned with surprising ease, the mechanism well oiled despite the door's great age, and Holmes drew the door inward in one smooth motion that admitted a rush of cold air so profound it seemed to carry winter's essence concentrated into physical form. Ice crystals formed instantly on the door's inner surface, spreading in fractal patterns that caught the light from the hall chandeliers, transforming the dark wood into a canvas of frozen artistry. And there, filling the doorway with its impossible presence, stood the figure we had watched transform throughout this strange night. Close to, it was far more remarkable than distance had suggested. The snow that composed its form had taken on a translucency that allowed the pale blue light within to shine through in patterns that reminded me of nothing so much as the veins and arteries I had studied in anatomy texts, a network of luminescence that pulsed with slow regularity, like a heartbeat measured in glacial time. The smooth oval where a face should be seemed to regard us with an attention that transcended mere sight, and I felt the weight of that regard settle upon me like snow accumulating on a winter branch, persistent and undeniable. Holmes stood his ground, the wooden box containing the stone figurine held before him like a talisman, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the threshold with surprising strength. I am Sherlock Holmes, and I stand here as representative of the Pemberton family, inheritors of the compact made in the year of our Lord 1273 by Sir Edmund Pemberton, Knight. The ritual was begun, but not completed. I have brought the token of binding, and I would see the compact honoured as it was originally intended. The figure remained motionless for a long moment, and then, with a sound like ice shifting on a frozen lake, it inclined its smooth head in what might have been acknowledgement. The blue light within it pulsed more brightly, and from somewhere deep within its crystalline structure came a voice, not words exactly, but rather impressions of meaning that formed themselves into comprehensible speech within the mind rather than the ear. The token was taken, the seal was broken, the cycle was interrupted. It was done in ignorance, not malice, Holmes replied, and I marvelled at his composure, at his ability to negotiate with something so far beyond ordinary experience, while maintaining the same rational approach he brought to consultations with human clients in our Baker Street sitting room. The knowledge of the compact's true nature had been lost over the generations, reduced to tradition without understanding. But we have recovered that knowledge, and we would restore what was broken. He opened the wooden box, revealing the pale green serpentine figurine that Lady Pemberton had brought to us mere hours ago, though it seemed like days had passed since we had departed London through the falling snow. The stone glowed with its own subtle luminescence, responding to the proximity of the larger figure before us, and I saw Holmes's hand tremble slightly as he held it forth. I have the token of binding, carved by the hand of Brother Aldrich in the year of the compact's making. I would press it into the vessel prepared for you, as was done each year for centuries uncounted, that you might walk these lands during the holy days, and renew the protection you have granted to this house and all who dwell within its bounds. The snow figure's arms, which had been extended toward the house, now lowered to its sides, and the light within it shifted in colour, the cold blue taking on warmer tones, hints of gold and amber threading through its crystalline form. It stepped backward, descending one step, then another, making space in the doorway, an invitation clear in the gesture. Holmes glanced at me, a question in his eyes, and I nodded, my hand moving unconsciously to the revolver in my pocket, though I knew as he had said, that it would prove useless against what we faced. Together we crossed the threshold, stepping out into the winter night where frost crunched beneath our boots and our breath created clouds that dissipated almost instantly in the presence of the figure's strange, radiant cold. The snow figure stood now at the base of the steps, its form perfectly still, waiting with that inhuman patience for the completion of the ritual that would satisfy the terms of the ancient compact. Holmes descended the steps slowly, holding the stone figurine before him like an offering, and I followed close behind, acutely conscious of the watching household gathered in the lit doorway, their faces pale with fear and fascination. As we reached the base of the steps, Holmes paused, withdrawing from his coat the folded parchment containing Sir Edmund's account of the ritual. He unfolded it with care, angling it to catch the moonlight, his eyes scanning the archaic script, his lips moving silently as he rehearsed the pronunciation of those strange syllables that predated civilized tongues. Then, with deliberate ceremony, he approached the snow figure, raising the stone token until it hovered before the place where the figure's chest would be, the place where a human heart would beat within its cage of ribs. The larger figure remained absolutely motionless, and I could have sworn that even the wind had stilled, that all of nature held itself in suspension as this moment approached its culmination. Holmes pressed the stone against the snow surface, and the material yielded like warm wax, accepting the token, drawing it inward until it was embedded exactly as tradition demanded. As soon as the stone made contact, a sound like a great bell being struck rang out across the frozen landscape, felt in the chest and bones more than heard with the ears, and the blue light within the figure blazed brighter, racing along its crystalline veins with renewed vigor. Now came the most crucial moment. Holmes cleared his throat, his hand still pressed against the figure's chest where the stone had been embedded, and began to speak the words of binding that Sir Edmund had recorded 7 centuries before. The syllables were harsh and angular, resistant to the human tongue, but Holmes pronounced them with as much precision as his considerable linguistic abilities could manage, his voice rising and falling in cadences that seemed to resonate with some fundamental frequency of the winter night itself. As he spoke, changes rippled through the snow figure. Its form became more defined still, features beginning to emerge from the smooth oval of its face, suggestion of eyes, the curve of a mouth, the outline of a nose, all rendered in translucent ice that caught and refracted the moonlight. The hands, which had been simple mittened shapes, developed fingers, each one distinct and articulated. And with each word Holmes spoke, the figure seemed to grow more present, more real, as though the ritual was anchoring it more firmly to this plane of existence. Then Holmes reached the final syllable, the last harsh sound that seemed to echo across the snow-covered lawns and into the dark woods beyond. And as it faded into silence, the figure moved. Its newly formed hand rose, the fingers flexing with liquid grace, and it touched the place where the stone had been embedded, pressing gently as though confirming its presence, as though verifying that the compact had indeed been properly restored. The voice came again, clearer now, still that strange impression of meaning, rather than actual sound, but more defined, more personal. The cycle is complete. The recognition is given. I walk these lands as was promised, and my protection extends over all who shelter here. The figure inclined its head to Holmes in a gesture of unmistakable courtesy, almost courtly in its formality. And then it turned and began to walk across the lawn with steps that left no prints in the snow, its form glowing against the darkness like a lantern carried through winter's heart. We watched as it moved toward the chapel ruins, its purpose unhurried, its movements suggesting not menace, but rather a kind of formal patrol, an inspection of the boundaries it had been bound to protect. A collective exhalation came from the household gathered in the doorway, tension releasing like a bowstring cut after being held at full draw too long. Holmes stood watching the retreating figure, his expression thoughtful, his hand still extended before him, as though he could still feel the cold, smooth surface of the snow against his palm. "Remarkable," he murmured, speaking more to himself than to me. "Utterly remarkable. Watson, we have just participated in something that predates rational science, something that exists in the spaces between what we know and what we have yet to understand." Sleep seemed an impossibility in those hours that followed the completion of the ritual, though the household gradually dispersed to their quarters with murmured assurances and backward glances toward the windows that faced the moonlit ground that faced the moonlit grounds. Lady Pemberton had insisted that hot tea be brought to the library, where Holmes and I had returned to continue our examination of the ancient documents, driven by a need to understand more fully what we had witnessed, to place it within some framework of comprehension that might allow the mind to rest even if true sleep remained elusive. The fire had burned low, requiring the addition of fresh logs that caught slowly, sending up spirals of fragrant smoke that mixed with the library's permanent atmosphere of old leather and aged paper. I found myself moving through the motions of pouring tea with hands that were steadier than I had any right to expect, given the extraordinary events of the evening, and Holmes accepted his cup with a nod of thanks, though his attention remained fixed upon a series of documents he had spread across the reading table in chronological order. "Look here, Watson," he said, his finger tracing a line of text in a household record from the early 15th century. Generation after generation, the tradition was maintained with scrupulous care. Each Christmas Eve, the figure was raised, the token pressed into place, and each year the accounts note abundant harvests, livestock thriving through harsh winters, no deaths from cold or hunger among the estate workers. The compact was honoured, and its benefits received. He moved his finger to a later document, this one from the 17th century. But here we see the beginning of the decline in understanding. The ritual is still performed, but the language changes. No longer do they speak of honouring a compact, but rather of maintaining a pleasant tradition. The supernatural element fades from acknowledged fact into folklore, and with that transition, the careful attention to detail begins to waver. I sipped my tea, welcoming its warmth, and considered the implications of what he was showing me. And yet, the protection continued, even as belief faded. Indeed, which suggests that the compact operated on principles more binding than mere faith or understanding. So long as the actions were performed correctly, regardless of whether those performing them comprehended their significance, the agreement held. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his sharp features softened slightly by fatigue and the warm glow of candlelight. It reminds us that there are forces in this world that exist independent of human comprehension, that operate according to laws we have yet to fully articulate. A sound from outside drew our attention once more to the windows. Not alarming this time, but rather musical, like wind chimes made of ice tinkling in a gentle breeze. Through the frost-patterned glass, we could see the glowing figure moving along the boundary of the estate, tracing a path that seemed to follow invisible lines of demarcation, marking territory in a manner as old as the concept of property itself. "It is patrolling," I observed, watching the steady progress of that luminous form through the winter landscape. Fulfilling its obligation, walking the lands as the compact specified. And in doing so, Holmes added, renewing whatever protections or blessings were originally granted. One can almost imagine Sir Edmund returning from the Crusades, bearing wounds and perhaps dark memories, encountering this entity in some desert place, and striking a bargain that would ensure his family's prosperity through the harshest seasons. A not unreasonable exchange, viewed from a certain perspective. The long case clock chimed midnight, its deep notes marking the transition from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day itself. And as if in response to that temporal milestone, the quality of light from outside changed subtly. The cold blue of the figure's radiance took on warmer tones, hints of silver and gold threading through its crystalline form, and the sense of ancient power that had surrounded it seemed to gentle somehow, to soften into something less forbidding. Holmes rose from his chair with a sudden movement, crossing to the window to observe more closely. "The transformation continues," he murmured. "As midnight passes, as Christmas Day properly begins, the nature of the presence changes. Whatever Malekith is, spirit, entity, manifestation of natural forces clothed in anthropomorphic form, it responds to the rhythms of the Christian calendar, suggesting either a fascinating adaptability or perhaps an even more ancient connection to the turning of seasons that the Christian festivals merely overlay." A soft knock at the library door preceded Lady Pemberton's entrance, wrapped in a heavy dressing gown against the night's chill, her hair loose about her shoulders in a manner that made her seem younger, more vulnerable than the composed matriarch we had first met in Baker Street. "Forgive the intrusion, gentlemen," she said quietly, "but I found I could not sleep, and I saw the lights still burning in the library. May I join you?" "Of course," Holmes replied, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "Your home is experiencing something quite remarkable, Lady Pemberton. It seems appropriate that you should witness it." She settled into the indicated chair, accepting tea with grateful hands, and for several minutes we sat in companionable silence, watching through the windows as the snow figure continued its measured circuit of the grounds. The moon had begun to set, and the eastern sky showed the first faint hints of dawn approaching, that subtle lightening of darkness that heralded the sun's eventual return. Holmes turned from the window, his expression thoughtful. "You touch upon something profound, Lady Pemberton. We live in an age that prizes rational understanding, that seeks to reduce all phenomena to measurable, explicable causes. And yet, as tonight has demonstrated, there are aspects of existence that resist such reduction, that operate according to principles our current science cannot adequately address." He moved to the table where the documents lay spread, his hand resting lightly on the parchment containing Sir Edmund's account. "Your ancestor was a practical man, I think. He had seen things in the Holy Land that challenged his understanding of the world, and rather than dismiss them as impossibilities, he chose to engage with them, to negotiate terms that would benefit his household and his descendants. There is wisdom in that approach, not blind faith, but rather a willingness to work with forces beyond full comprehension, to establish relationships based on mutual obligation rather than attempting to control or deny what cannot be controlled or denied. A log in the fireplace split with a sharp crack, sending up a shower of sparks that danced briefly before fading, and the sudden sound seemed to punctuate Holmes's words with emphasis. Lady Pemberton's gaze moved between the two of us, settling finally on my friend's face with an expression of curiosity mixed with something approaching awe. "You are a remarkable man, Mr. Holmes," she said simply. "When I came to you in Baker Street, I hoped for a rational explanation, something that would allow me to dismiss the extraordinary events occurring at my home as elaborate hoaxes or natural phenomena misunderstood. Instead, you have led me to a far stranger conclusion, that the legends were true, that my family has been protected for centuries by a compact with something that exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary existence. And how do you feel about that revelation?" Holmes asked, genuine interest in his tone. She considered the question carefully before answering, her eyes moving to the window where the glowing figure could still be seen moving through the pre-dawn darkness. "Humbled," she said at last, "and strangely reassured. There is comfort in knowing that we do not stand alone against the harshness of the world, that relationships forged in good faith and honored with integrity can transcend the limits of mortal understanding. My ancestor made a promise, and for 700 years that promise has been kept, creating a continuity that connects me to him across the vast gulf of time." Holmes nodded slowly, and I saw in his face an expression I had rarely witnessed, a kind of peace, as though some question that had troubled him had found, if not an answer, then at least a framework within which it could rest. "You will continue the tradition, then?" he asked, though the answer seemed already evident. "I will," she confirmed, her voice carrying the weight of commitment. "And I will ensure that my children understand not merely the actions to be performed, but the significance behind them. The knowledge that was lost shall be restored, and perhaps in some small way we can honor not only the compact itself, but also the courage of the man who made it." The sky beyond the windows continued its slow transformation from black to deep blue to the pale grey that precedes true dawn, and with that gradual change, the luminous figure began to move back toward the chapel ruins, its patrol complete, its obligations for this night fulfilled. We watched in silence as it approached the ancient stones, and there, in that place where the original compact had been sealed and the token hidden for safekeeping, it came to rest. Dawn broke over Pemberton Hall with a silence more profound than any sound could achieve, the sky transforming itself through gradations of colour. So subtle they seemed less like changes and more like revelations, as though the true nature of morning had been present all along, and only now chose to reveal itself to watching eyes. The snow-covered landscape caught and held that growing light, reflecting it back in shades of pearl and rose and palest gold, transforming the familiar grounds into something that might have existed in some painter's imagination of paradise, where winter reigned not as hardship, but as beauty distilled to its essential form. We had moved to the library's eastern windows, drawn by the prospect of witnessing sunrise after such a night, and now we stood watching as the last stars faded from view and the moon, grown pale and ghostly, settled toward the western horizon like a departing guest who had overstayed welcome but was leaving with grace intact. The snow figure remained at the chapel ruins, its luminescence fading as natural light increased, its form becoming less distinct, as though it were gradually returning to the simple snow from which it had been originally fashioned. Holmes had been silent for some time, his gaze fixed upon the distant figure with that peculiar intensity that suggested his mind was working through implications and possibilities, constructing theories and testing them against observed facts in that internal laboratory where his genius performed its most important work. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of wonder that I had rarely heard from him, a quality that acknowledged mystery without seeking to immediately dispel it. "It is returning to dormancy," he observed, his breath creating a small cloud against the cold window pane. "The ritual complete, the recognition given, it withdraws into quiescence until the cycle demands its presence once more. And in that withdrawal, we see the elegance of the compact. Neither party demands more than was agreed. Neither seeks to extend the terms beyond what was originally specified. There is honor in that, a kind of integrity that transcends species, or perhaps even existence itself." Lady Pemberton stood beside us, her hand resting lightly on the window frame, her expression peaceful, despite the sleepless night we had all endured. "I find myself wondering," she said softly, "what Sir Edmund must have felt that first Christmas after making the compact, when he raised the snow figure and pressed the token into place, and watched as something impossible took form before his eyes. Terror, certainly, but perhaps also hope, the belief that he had secured something valuable for those who would come after him. Hope purchased at what cost, though? I found myself asking, the physician in me considering the pragmatic aspects of such bargains. What did he give in return for this protection? The document spoke of tribute and recognition, but surely there must have been more to the exchange. Holmes turned to face me, his expression thoughtful. "An excellent question, Watson, and one I have been pondering myself. The documents we examined made no mention of sacrifice in the traditional sense, no offerings of blood or treasure, no demands for servitude or worship. Rather, the compact seems to have been based on mutual obligation. Malekith agreed to protect the Pemberton lands through winter's harshest manifestations, and in return, the family agreed to provide recognition, to acknowledge his presence and his protection through the annual ritual." He paused, his fingers drumming against his leg in that characteristic gesture that accompanied deep thought. "But there is a cost nonetheless, though perhaps a subtle one. The family became bound to this place, to the annual performance of the ritual, to the maintenance of traditions they might not fully understand. They sacrificed, if you will, a certain freedom, the freedom to abandon the estate, to let traditions lapse, to move forward without the weight of ancestral obligations. In an age where mobility and progress are increasingly valued, such constraints carry their own burden." A servant appeared at the library door, tentative in his approach, bearing fresh tea and a tray of bread and preserves. The normality of the offering seemed almost jarring after the extraordinary nature of the night. Yet there was comfort in it as well, a reminder that life continued in its ordinary rhythms, despite encounters with the extraordinary. We accepted the refreshments gratefully, the warm bread and sweet preserves tasting particularly delicious after our long vigil. As we ate, the sun finally cleared the eastern horizon, sending shafts of golden light across the snow-covered landscape. And in that radiance, the figure at the chapel ruins underwent its final transformation. The luminescence that had animated it throughout the night faded completely, the blue-white glow subsiding like embers cooling to ash, and the form itself seemed to settle, to compact, becoming once more what it had been at the beginning, a simple construction of snow, human-shaped but clearly inanimate, remarkable only in its proportions and placement. "It is done," Lady Pemberton whispered, and in her voice was relief mingled with something that might have been regret, as though she mourned the departure of the extraordinary, even as she welcomed the return of normalcy. Holmes set down his teacup with deliberate care, his movements suggesting a decision reached, a course of action determined. "Lady Pemberton, with your permission, I should like to examine the figure one final time before it melts entirely. There may be details observable in daylight that were obscured during the night, and I confess to a scientific curiosity about the physical changes that have occurred." "Of course, Mr. Holmes. Shall I have Thomas meet you there?" "That would be most helpful, yes. Watson, will you accompany me?" I nodded, already moving toward the door, and within minutes we were once again bundled into our coats and venturing out into the Christmas morning. The air was crisp and clean, carrying that particular quality of cold that invigorates rather than debilitates, and our breath created plumes of vapour that dissipated quickly in the gentle breeze that had begun to stir with the sunrise. Thomas met us at the chapel ruins, his weathered face reflecting a mixture of relief and residual awe. Together we approached the snow figure, which stood motionless in the growing light, and I was struck by how ordinary it appeared now, how thoroughly it had returned to being simply packed, snow shaped into human form. Yet, when Holmes reached out to touch its surface, his expression changed. "Interesting," he murmured, his gloved fingers pressing gently against the snow. "Feel this, Watson. The temperature is notably warmer than the surrounding snow, and the density is different as well. The molecular structure has been altered, compressed, and transformed by whatever force inhabited it during the night." I placed my own hand against the figure and confirmed his observation. Where ordinary snow would have been loosely packed, easily disturbed, this felt almost solid, like ice, or perhaps even stone, yet it retained the appearance of snow, each individual flake still visible on the surface. "It will melt slowly," Thomas observed, "more slowly than natural snow. I've seen it before, though never understanding why. The figure always lasts well into January, sometimes into February, long after the rest of the snow has gone. Now I know it's because it ain't natural snow anymore. Not exactly. It's been changed by what walked in it." Holmes nodded, still examining the figure with meticulous attention. "And the token," he said, indicating the spot on the figure's chest where he had pressed the serpentine stone hours earlier. "Do you see how it has been absorbed entirely? Not merely pressed into the surface, but integrated into the matrix of ice and snow, visible only as a slight discoloration, a greenish tinge in the otherwise white material. Indeed, looking closely, I could perceive what he indicated, a subtle variation in colour, centred on the chest, spreading outward like veins, or perhaps like the roots of some plant growing within the snow itself. The stone figurine had become part of the larger whole, bound into it through processes that defied conventional understanding. "When it melts," Holmes mused, speaking more to himself than to us, "the token will be revealed once more, lying where the figure stood. And next Christmas Eve, the cycle will begin again, the figure raised, the token pressed into place, the compact renewed, An elegant system, really, self-perpetuating so long as the basic requirements are met. The sun continued its ascent, warming the winter landscape, and somewhere in the nearby woods a robin began to sing, its voice clear and sweet in the morning stillness. Church bells from the village began to ring, calling the faithful to Christmas services, and the sound carried across the snowy fields with a clarity that distance rendered musical. Holmes stepped back from the figure, his examination apparently complete, and turned to survey the chapel ruins in the growing light. "Thomas, show me again where the chamber was found, where the cornerstone was removed." The groundskeeper led us to the spot, now clearly visible in daylight, where fresh mortar marked recent repairs. Holmes knelt beside it, running his fingers over the stones, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "The seal was not merely physical," he said at length. "Look here, at the edges of the cornerstone. These markings, barely visible, worn almost smooth by time, they are the same symbols that appear on the token itself, a binding sigil that linked the stone to this place, creating a closed circuit of power. When the cornerstone was removed, that circuit was broken, and the token's binding was disrupted. The figure, raised without the proper anchor, became instead a beacon, calling to Malekith across whatever distances separate his realm from ours. He stood, brushing snow from his knees, his expression satisfied. The mystery is solved, the mechanism understood. What remains is simply the execution of tradition, which you, Thomas, have performed admirably for many years, and will, I trust, continue to perform for many more.